Hello. I don't know what's going wrong with The Guardian, but something is seriously wrong with it. It was talking about TERFs in a sort of admiring way and rehabilitating J.K. Rowling only a few days ago, and now it's done a piece on Corbyn, which is not exactly the most effusive. It's not terribly against, but it's certainly not the way it used to be. Something is going on with that newspaper. I don't know what, but anyway, look, I'll read this. You see, because Jeremy Corbyn is apparently urging the West to stop arming Ukraine. He says here, pouring arms isn't going to bring about a solution. Now, that is his opinion. That's not a fact. It might very well bring a solution one way or the other. For instance, in Britain, we were, and the Americans were sailing boats over the Northern Passage to over north of Norway and Sweden and Finland and those and into a northern port in Russia to get them supplies, food, armaments, all sorts, so they could fight the Germans. Now, I'm not sure that Corbyn would have been at that time, say, if he'd have been alive at that time, would he have been saying, no, we're just prolonging the war by fighting the Germans? Would he have told Stalin to stand down in Stalingrad, tell his troops to just stop fighting and let the Germans just go in? Why did the Germans go into Russia? They went into Russia because they wanted the oil. They wanted control over the oil. The big problem that the German army had was oil. It didn't have any. And they spent a lot of scientific effort trying to find substitutes for oil or ways of getting around things without using oil, and artificial rubber for tyres and that sort of thing. That's a very well-known thing, and the Germans went into Russia and that's why they were making such so nice to the Romanians. They really needed that oil. Now the Russians are invading Ukraine for similar reasons. If Russia had got control of Ukraine, I mean, we've seen what's going on here. Whatever you think about the rights and the wrongs, you know, however many Mearsheimer lectures you have seen, which say that the NATO pushed Russia into reacting in this way, you have to consider this, that now that it's difficult for grain to get out of Ukraine and that we can't buy grain from Russia anymore because we're boycotting the place, there are places now that are starting to be on the edge of starvation. And there are fierce negotiations going on to try and get some of Ukraine's grain out. If Russia had complete control over the Ukrainian grain production, that would have given them an enormous amount of power. And it's not just the grain. There are tremendous riches of underground resources in Ukraine as well. And it's not that Russia needs that stuff, but it can exert a tremendous amount of power over the rest of the world simply by withholding it. So we have to consider that when you've got people like Corbyn saying this is going to prolong the war. This is a war the West has to at least come to a standstill on, if not actually win. Because they have to stop Russia from getting too much control over the world's food supplies. It's only now that a lot of people have realised exactly how important Ukraine is to the rest of the world's food supplies. Anyway, I shall continue. That's my opinion. This is The Guardian now. Jeremy Corbyn has urged Western countries to stop arming Ukraine. Corbyn gave the interview on Al Mayadeen, a Beirut-based TV channel that has carried pro-Russia reporting since Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And you see how The Guardian said, Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Now, this I think is quite new. They are actually using the word invasion. They are not talking about the military operation, the Russian military operation, which is relatively neutral. They're talking about Putin, the bad guy, you know, the moustache-twirling bad guy. And he invaded Ukraine. You see what I mean about the Guardian sort of somehow changing its tune? I'm getting a bit suspicious of this. Anyway, I shall continue. What I find disappointing is that hardly any of the world's leaders use the word peace. They always use the language of more war and more bellicose war. Well, I don't notice the Russians exactly talking about peace either. They're just talking about land grabs. If you see any Russian television now, it's all about how they're going to take the south of Ukraine. They want the whole of Ukraine, but meanwhile they're talking about south, going into Moldova. There are maps on Russian media of various sorts showing Russia, which includes a Russia that includes Ukraine, and it also includes Lithuania and Latvia. Now, you see, Russia has form on this. Nothing to do with NATO when they took 20% of Georgia. They just went in and we said nothing. And Georgia was fighting like lions. And of course, they weren't getting very far. And that's very sad. But Russia did that. And then it went into 20% of Ukraine and took Crimea and Donbass and Luhansk, or Luhansk if you're talking Ukrainian. And nobody did anything. But, you know, that really isn't their land to take. Now, I could see why Russia wanted Crimea and maybe a corridor to Crimea. I can very well understand that because warm water ports are a problem. But they invaded the place. And I get people constantly on my, you know, threads underneath saying, well, the Ukrainians spent a lot of time shelling Luhansk and Donbass. And they killed, I think they said 14,000 people have died. And that's a Russian statistic. That includes Ukrainians who died in the fighting, by the way. So, you know, there are lies, damn lies and statistics. Yeah, people have died, though. It's not nice. But that was part of Ukrainian territory. So, yeah, you can say NATO was being unpleasant. You can say that. I don't think NATO was, but, you know, it's an argument. It's a reasonable argument. But the fact is that Russia invaded. And they're talking about war and more war. They're talking about bombing the United Kingdom. So I don't see why Corbyn is talking about Western leaders talking about war all the time. And the Russians are talking about war as well. OK, so Corbyn said, this war is disastrous for the people of Ukraine. Well, you know, Russian occupation was disastrous for the people of Ukraine in the 30s. And we have no idea what the Russians would have done with the people in Ukraine if they just invaded easily. OK, it's disastrous for the people of Ukraine, for the people of Russia, yeah, for sure. And for the safety and security of the whole world, and that's true, that's absolutely true. This could escalate very badly. And so you have to make a decision. Are you going to stand up to a bully, or are you going to just let that bully you further and further and further back until your back is actually against that wall? You know, it's a decision. You can say, no, we're not going to fight back because it's too much, like we did in Georgia or Crimea. We can do that. But I think when you've got a hungry monster like Russia is right now, then you're never going to appease it. But that's my opinion. I mean, you're allowed to have your own opinion about that. Some people think that Russia is, you know, peaceable and all sweetness and light. He called for the UN to be more centre stage. I wish it were, but the UN is a cesspit of political rivalries and opportunism, and it's never going to do very much. I think the UN should be wound up. Something might be appropriate, but I'm afraid the UN is now just a huge gravy train, and suggested involving other international bodies such as the African Union, yes, or the League of Arab States. You know what? If the League of Arab States ever got together and actually agreed on anything, then you would find me taking cover in the cellar, because the world will have stopped turning. Okay, if the UN were unable to help negotiate a ceasefire, I wish the UN, for instance, had just come in and helped get those grain exports out of the war zones. That's what the UN should have been doing. But have I heard anything about that? No. Just a few countries got together and made an agreement to help get the boats out. Elsewhere in the interview, Corbyn condemned his expulsion from the parliamentary party, calling it disgraceful. I spent my life in the Labour Party. I joined the Labour Party even before England won the World Cup in 1966. He brings in the sports thing, that's supposed to appeal to the common man, I think. I was proud to lead the Labour Party, yeah, and he was also proud to lead the Labour Party straight into the buffers, and he will not admit that he did that. He cited Labour's strong performance in the 2017 general election. Yeah, and the surge in membership on his watch. Yes, and it was a surge of members who, most of whom have now been expelled because they were not very nice people. I think the way I've been treated is disgraceful, and the allegations against me are disgraceful. He also suggested that he'd been criticised over anti-Semitism because of his stance on the Middle East. I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that my clearly stated support for the right of Palestinian people to be able to live in peace, free from occupation, from under siege. Just a minute. You know how you get people, you meet them at parties occasionally and they have an obsession, and whatever you're talking about, in this case it's Ukraine, and then he can't stop by skidding off into Palestine. So you go to a party and this guy, and he's interested in 20th century telegraph poles, and you say something, you look out the window and you say, oh, it's a lovely evening, and he says, oh yes, there was a telegraph pole that was invented to deal with rain and fair weather without warping, and it was made out of a particular sort of wood and cut in a certain sort of way and has certain sorts of fixtures on it that don't rust, that sort of thing. And then, or on another occasion, you might say you're going to see I don't know, the latest film, whatever it is, the one that everyone's talking about. And this guy says, oh, yeah, but that's set in 2090. And there's a telegraph pole in there that was actually made in 1930. And it's completely wrong because they would have replaced it by now. Well, you know those sorts of people. They are people who are absolutely obsessed by one thing, and whatever you talk about, they manage to circulate the conversation back. Well, so he's talking about Ukraine, and suddenly he can't stop talking about Palestine. And then so the Guardian, instead of going full throttle on this, the Labour MP Margaret Hodge condemned his remarks. She said, to suggest our fight against anti-Semitism on the left means that we're all part of a conspiracy to smear Corbyn is frankly absurd. A Labour source said of Corbyn's comments, Labour source, who? Don't know. There cannot be any ambiguity about the choice he's making, and that's to put himself outside the Labour mainstream. Starmer has offered staunch support for the government's stance on Ukraine, including the provision of weapons and military training to the country's troops. You see, the thing about Starmer is he's the sort of person who will kneel for Black Lives Matter. So he will do whatever is fashionable. And so I don't trust what he says, but he said that, and I happen to agree with it at the moment. He has stressed Labour's long-standing backing for NATO, which is preparing to expand significantly in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now look at that, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They are actually saying invasion here. And that's really I find that really interesting. They're not talking about the Russian military operation and they're skidding around the idea. Yeah, it's an invasion now, even in The Guardian. In a Guardian article earlier this year, Starmer said of Stop the War, of which Corbyn is a luminary, at best they are naive. Yeah, at worst they actively give succor to authoritarian leaders who directly threaten democracies. Yeah, you know, Ukraine may have been the most corrupt country in the world, but I'd say America is running a pretty close second on that. The fact is that Zelensky had really only just been elected, so we don't know. I mean, the corruption was under the communist style leadership. That's because communism breeds corruption. So he'd been ousted and Zelensky being brought in, and he only had a year or so before this war started, didn't he? It wasn't very long anyway, and it takes a while to root out systemic corruption. So saying that Ukraine deserved to be invaded because it was corrupt is, that is, in my opinion, not an argument. All right, well, the main reason I read this article is to point out that there's something funny going on with The Guardian, more than there's something funny going on with Corbyn, because there's always been something funny going on with Corbyn and we know about that. Right, I am Granniopteryx. I'm to be found on YouTube, Rumble, BitChute and Minds. I am on Twitter, Gab and Parler as @Granniopteryx. I do urge you to subscribe to one of those because especially YouTube tends not to inform people when I've uploaded a new video. And also, if you're on YouTube, click the subscribe button. If you're already subscribed, check your subscribe button, because that's something else that they do. They drop subscriptions. I don't know whether that's deliberate or just, you know, some sort of wrong mechanism, but it happens a lot. Okay, that's it. Please like this video. Please, that helps with the algorithm. Please share it. Please, as I say, make sure of your subscription and contribute to the channel if you can. I'm grateful for anything you do, from sharing to contributing financially. All right, that's it. Well, till next time. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Granniopteryx design or Granbo, with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.granniopteryx.com and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share.